don't have to do any weird camp counselor thing to get people interested. Yay! Hello. Hi, and welcome to our first external speaker of 2020. Yeah. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks everyone on this gray January day, or February Eve as I like to call it. So as is tradition in this department, we have some swag for you.
Oh, wow.
There's an umbrella. Very good umbrella. Don't open it indoors. Yeah, it's we have cheaper ones and nicer ones, and this is one of the nicer ones. That's what she does all the time. A tumbler. Okay. And a water bottle. Oh, and a couple other doodads. Anyway, yeah. So,
everybody will know that I was at the Ohio State University. Got that down, but it's the
yeah, so and then I'll let Becky give you a more substantive introduction.
All right, well, I'm very pleased to introduce Sapana Doshi today as our first speaker of 2020. Sapana is an associate professor of critical race and ethnic studies at UC Merced. This is her first semester there, so a big move. So until recently, she was an associate professor in geography and development at the University of Arizona, and she got her PhD and master's degree in geography from the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm really happy to invite her here today and to get to introduce her, not because I get to see an old friend, which sometimes what this is about, but in fact because I get to meet somebody whose work I really greatly admire and have her come here, so this is really great. Sapana's work is at the intersection of cultural politics and political economy of cities in the global south, with a focus on Mumbai in India, of course. I've been drawn to her work since I'm not a cultural geographer of the city or India. I've been drawn to her work in particular for developing frameworks of feminist political ecology and political geography, her work in critical development studies and urban geography. I think many of us here, including several of our students, unfortunately some past students who aren't here, will find significant overlap with specific themes and topics of her work, including slums, eviction, dispossession, gentrification, greening, and citizenship. Looking at Sam. We had conversations.
The developmental state, colonial formations, and critical geography of corruption. Embodied urban political ecology and explicit focus on gender and race. Sapana's articles have appeared in a range of geography and urban studies journals. She's received, recently held a coveted fellowship from the American Council of Learning Societies to develop her collaborative work on corruption narratives in the Millennial City. And her talk today is on racial capitalism and the politics of global urbanization, slightly different title, A View from Mumbai. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Becky, for helping to bring me here. Joel, Darla, Kim, I don't know if she's around, all of you here for making me feel welcome. I had such a wonderful time talking with the faculty here and the graduate students for engaging conversations. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to having lots of continuing questions and discussion. So I want to kind of speak with you today about my ongoing research in Mumbai, which is around dispossession and the politics of dispossession. And I've been sort of working with a new framing. It's not really a new framing. I've been working in this framing for a little while, right? But finding that it's become more and more an important kind of framing for us to deal with. And so now that I've moved to a critical race and ethnic studies department, working in the area of racial capitalism much more explicitly is something that I'm moving into more. And so bringing this into conversation with my work in a new way. And I had a conversation with one of the graduate students at the end of our lunch, and it was kind of the perfect segue. He was like, so can you tell me about the relationship between race and class? I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a really big question, and it's really the question, right? when we think about our political climate in so many parts of the world, especially in the United States right now, with the election of Trump, right, the discourse was, is it about race? Is it about Trump's racism? Is it about, no, it's not. It's about the economy, stupid. And really needing some different frameworks, right? And needing different frameworks not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world, really, right? Including India, where we have an ethno-nationalist, populist government. We see this in Turkey. We see this in Brazil. We see this in so many parts of the world, where we can no longer disaggregate difference, right? Identity-based difference, or race, or caste, or religion, from the politics of dispossession, from economic processes, and thinking about it on a global scale. So, in thinking about racial capitalism, I think that we owe a great deal of debt to Cedric Robinson, who was one of the initial founders. So I'm not going to spend too long. I wanted to dive into it, but I think this is so important. It's a word that's thrown around a lot, and this foundational thinker who really died just 3 years ago, pretty much got no attention, but was a monumental thinker, and I think we owe a lot of debt. And he's really been helping me think through some of the ways in which I frame my work right now. And so, one of the things that Cedric Robinson did in developing this concept of racial capitalism is really taking on Marx, right, for dismissing radical movements outside of Europe, right, thinking that because of the ways in which there was a transition from feudalism to capitalism, you have the European working class as the kind of liberal subject of history, and that things like slavery and it was colonialism and slavery were sort of aberrations to the capitalist project and soon be taken over, and really not paying attention to radical movements around the world. But how did he do this, right? He did this ironically, or actually brilliantly, by going to Europe, right? He says, in order to understand this sort of misconception, right, we need to actually look at the history of capitalism within Europe, right? What really happened? And really challenging this kind of discourse, right? That capitalism was a negation of feudalism, right? That it was about this revolutionary movement away from feudalism, but that actually what we really saw was that within Europe itself was the seed, were the seeds of racialism, right? That early proletarians within Europe, right, these working classes, were racialized subjects, were racial subjects to begin with, right? That nationalism, slavery, violence, dispossession were all racial. Colonialism itself was they were all racial projects, right, within Europe to begin with. And so you don't have this kind of, break from feudalism, right? And this is not, I think sometimes when people think about, okay, there are groups like the Irish, right, who were racialized. This is not to dismiss the real violence of anti-Black racism and slavery and all of these dimensions, but really to call into question this idea of capitalism, this idea of the legal subject, right? And to really see that actually you cannot disaggregate racism from capitalism from the very initial, right, and from the very beginnings. And so I think that this is really important for us when we think about, is this a question of race or is this a question of class, what we're looking at today? And I think we owe a lot of debt to Cedric Robinson for some of this work, right? Of really looking at the history of the early European working classes as racial subjects who later became white, right? But were not considered white in the way we understand it now. And that nationalism, which is a big kind of project, a racial project in much of the world, right, was really relied on the naturalization of the superiority of some Europeans. So why does this all matter? And I'm going to, drawing on Cedric Robinson, this quote here by Dirty Element really encapsulates this idea of racial capitalism, right? That capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Capitalists with the means of production, workers without the means of subsistence, creditors, debtors, conquerors of land made the property, the dispossessed, and removed. These antinomies of accumulation require loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value. Racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. Okay, so what does this have to do with global urbanization? And so I'm kind of thinking about, racial capitalism on a global scale, as well as sort of within the context of India. So I'm just kind of thinking about it right now globally, right? So the first kind of trend of racial capitalism is that I want to highlight is that more and more people around the world are living in cities, right, in urban areas, or they're moving into urban areas, or they're trying to at least, right? They're not making a livelihood in rural areas, right? Because of the uneven fallouts of colonial extraction, capitalist development, modernization, neoliberal globalization, all of these Asians, right? We have people in massive debt, losing land, losing livelihood, and the policies that are in place, the economic system in place, is actually not creating jobs, not creating other livelihoods, and so huge portions of the world are rendered surplus to our economic system, right? Sort of eking a life out, in the informal sector. And so, along with other scholars of racial and post-colonial capitalism, I see this as a situation in which, non-white, formerly colonized people are rendered extraneous, right? Surplus populations. This is a process of racialization on a global scale, right? Left to live in precarity, left to live, process of marginalization, hyper exploitation, dispossession, right? And so people moving into cities, living in the informal sector, in so-called slums, having very little access to the basic conditions of life, right? Living in precarity, without basic services, etc. And I think this is a really important thing in terms of thinking about, Ruthie Gilmore's famous definition of what is racism, right? The vulnerability to premature death, state-sanctioned exploitation, vulnerability to premature death is really what we're seeing in much of it. Another aspect of racial capitalism, right, is another kind of urbanization, and the urbanization of people. We also have the urbanization of capital, right? Finance capital moving into urban spaces to be able to, in the city of Mumbai, which I look at, right, this creation of world-class cities, of the global city. And so people who have already been displaced, dispossessed, are finding themselves experiencing new rounds of dispossession and displacement to make way for these development projects. And of course, urban Marxist geographers talk about this as a process of ongoing creative accumulation by dispossession. That this is about not just profits through expanded reproduction, right, through profits, but actually through plunder people's lands, and that's something that I'm going to be talking about more right now. So land and resources being usurped in a number of different ways: commodification, privatization, and land dispossession. But I also think what's really important here is that in this process is a legitimacy crisis, right? A legitimacy crisis, a crisis in democratic places, and how do you manage surplus populations, right? And so I'm a critical development scholar as well, really looking at the politics of development as this process of managing surplus populations that are rendered extraneous or are dispossessed, right, excluded from the economy through various international discourses of development, interventions that are meant to kind of ostensibly, help the poor, help themselves, and sort of make their way through a global economy that is clearly not in their favor, right? And women, something that I've looked at a lot, being the real kind of not only considered the beneficiaries but the deliverers of this promise of development, with all kinds of problematic implications in terms of the responsibilities that their bodies are taking on in the process. We can talk more about this later. But sort of this dual character, right, of racial capitalism here, of both sort of producing these fallouts and then attempting, right, to manage these fallouts, right, this double movement, as Kalani would say. And so moving into, so how does this all get worked out, right? And I think that thinking about racial capitalism helps us to think about this, right? So I want to move a little bit into India, what's going on in India right now. This was one of the mottos of the president or the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who is well known for his sort of espousal of Hindu nationalist identity, right? Coming through radical wings of an organization called the RSS and into politics on the backs of really villainizing, right, the Muslims in the country and outside of the country, right? And doing that, also kind of espousing a very pro-corporate economic agenda, really moving away from this, what would be considered, with all of its limitations, a kind of socialist project within India, right, towards a more neoliberal pro-corporate. But also the thing that people don't understand, don't talk about as much, is that he was really seen as a kind of, he was brought into power, right, as a kind of, eschewing his role in the national politics, as a kind of developmentalist leader, right? And so this motto that he wrote into victory in his election was that, look, I know that I'm known for temples, I know that I'm seen as a Hindutva leader, a Hindu nationalist leader, but I'm really interested in toilets for the nation first, right? Toilets first, temples later. And so really trying to understand, okay, what does this Hindu nationalist kind of ideology have to do, and how does it play out on the ground, right, in terms of development politics? But these are sometimes seen in different categories. And in my own work, I see them as really deeply interconnected. And this kind of pro-development, pro-poor image of Modi has undergone severe tarnishing. There's been recent kind of protest against Modi. He came up with this kind of citizenship policy that explicitly targets Muslims, in the naturalization process, and people are starting to see that the Hindutva, the distancing of himself from the Hindu nationalist project, has not really happened, right? That he has been very much involved. And I'm involved in a group right now that's looking at this question of racialization within India, and really trying to see, how some of the ways in which the targeting of minorities, the sort of casteism, all of these ways in which certain groups of people are oppressed, experience violence, is a form of racialization, right? So discrimination against Northeast tribes, the criminalization of the Adivasis or indigenous groups, the public lynchings of beef eaters, right? Ostensibly Dalits, which were the lower class groups, the historically oppressed lower caste groups, Muslims, mob violence against African students, and the ways in which some of these forms of violence are now seeing a lot of pushback. And I think that it's important to think of this not just as a question of identity politics, but as being now increasingly by certain radical anti-caste movements and leaders as really deeply entwined with the economic, political economy, right, so, of the country. And so one of the big anti-caste leaders, Hayat Umar, who was actually jailed for an anti-nationalist speech that he had made a couple years ago, has now gone into politics, and he says, let us not forget, Modi has used religion to accentuate the fault lines, and he has failed to create jobs, his promise of creating jobs and providing, right? I don't want anybody to forget this. Okay. So, just a little bit of a roadmap of where I've come from. So I wanted to just kind of contextualize racial capitalism, dispossession on a global scale before I get into nitty-gritty of Mumbai, introduce Mumbai, and get into some of these actual practices on the ground, where race, religion, land struggle, and ostensibly inclusive development, right, how they play out on the ground. Uncompensated evictions and questions of ethno-national belonging, and looking at embodied forms of dispossession through the toxic resettlement of Dalit communities. So I'm just going to kind of go through a few different examples of how what I'm thinking of as racial capitalism really plays out. Okay, so for those of you who don't know where Mumbai is, one of the largest cities in western part of the western part of India, and one of India's most populous. I think it's actually the most densely populated city. In sort of the shiny, I know a lot of folks here work on China. Mumbai wants to be the next Shanghai, India's finance capital, right? And so over the last 20 years, with the liberalization of the economy, you've had intensified efforts to promote redevelopment through infrastructure, real estate, a real kind of bonanza of real estate development in the effort of creating this global city infused with all kinds of wealth, right? And a new kind of upper middle class seeking consumption opportunities. And so this kind of effort to create India's global finance capital and all of the amenities and infrastructure that it goes with, land is a big part of this project, right? Land struggle is a big aspect of it. And so real estate, infrastructure, redevelopment are incredibly lucrative frontiers for economic growth. Because of the extreme inequalities within Mumbai, you have very high real estate values. This is the Amani house, I think possibly the most expensive piece of real estate in the world, a single family home, right? And lots of people living in a city with real estate values as high as London, Singapore, New York, right? In certain areas, the inequities in terms of access to land and housing means that over 55% of the population lives in informal settlements or substandard settlements called slums. And thus, with rising real estate value, the struggle over land and evictions, the removal of slums and slum dwellers has become a major issue. This is an image from one of the largest demolition drives that when I was starting my PhD research, I kind of stumbled into. I was going to work on water, and then it ended up being land because people were like, we don't want to talk about water anymore because, basically up to 300,000 people were evicted in one fell swoop, right? For this kind of vision of redeveloping the city into a global finance center. So this has major impacts. This is not a small story. And finding that in the process of all of this, that certain groups were especially marginalized, people that historically dispossessed, historically marginalized, Dalits, the lower caste groups, ethnic minorities, and especially Muslims that are vilified, right, within the space of the city as not belonging. And sort of thinking about slums in general, as Joel knows, and has written about Sena, right? These are spaces of economic vibrancy. There's a lot of economic activity that goes on, production that really provides services, products, and livelihoods to people, right? So we're talking not just about losing homes, but losing livelihoods when we remove slums. So Kalyan Sanyal talks about this as the non-capitalist need economy, right? So we're already seeing people being displaced, extraneous to the global economy now in this eviction process, having that be even more compounded, right? Okay. So I'm going to enter now into, I've been talking a lot. I'm going to show a little clip of a movie to wake everybody up that illustrates some of, some music. We're going to have a little Bollywood.
Let's bring on Bollywood.
To bring this to life a little bit. Okay, so I just want to introduce this film. How many people have seen this film, Kala? It's great. Yeah. 2 people, usual suspects have seen it. I recommend this film to everyone. A, it's a lot of fun. B, it's actually very smartly done. C, it was quite a revolutionary thing in the sense of it's for the first time a major movie that got a lot of popular attention both within India and the rest of the world by a Dalit filmmaker, right, B. Ranjit. And focus for me was really exciting because it was focused on my research topic on Mumbai, and really bringing in this question of racial capitalism, I think, to the fore. Right, so we're looking at Dharavi, which is a major slum in Mumbai that was planning to go, has been in the works of going under redevelopment. There's been so many social movements against it, and it just hasn't gone through. And the story comes from the perspective of Dalits, actually, and also Muslim minorities that are facing these builders, right, these developers, right, who want to take over their slum and, you know, create these fancy high-rises, are promising resettlement, everything that I research is in this movie. And doing it from a perspective of caste and identity, right? And Kala actually means black. And so there's a lot of tropes, right, of black versus white, right? And so we see this kind of global salience. We have a lot of hip hop in this. It's really drawing on the sort of historical inspirations between the anti-caste movement and the black freedom struggles in the United States. But also thinking through terms of caste, right? Because within India, if you're in a lower caste, you get stigmatized as, not only are you doing the most sort of menial and toxic and polluting jobs, your very body is considered polluted, right? And so there are all these stigmatized ideologies. You're separated because of that if you're from this community, so spatial segregation, right? And so this movie comes from the perspective of land, right? There's a long history that is actually a pre-capitalist history, right? Of land being taken over by upper caste groups, and now in this moment, right, this is being reproduced in the name of development. Okay. Oops. So this is
நாளை கணேச கோயிலுக்கு வந்து பாரு நீங்க விடுதலை இயக்கம் தான் டெண்டர் எங்களுக்கு தான் கிடைச்சிருக்கு உம்மா அசுர கூட தலைவரையும் கூட்டம் சேரும் கேட்டுச்சா கேட்டுச்சு தாரணி இப்போ இது எப்படி மாறா போகுது பார்க்கலாமா
Okay, I just want to point out one thing right here. You can see here, Manu Realty. If anybody knows Indian society knows about what the caste system is all about. The laws of Manu are the ones that really enshrine caste within the Hindu scriptures. So these are the Manu Realtor, right? So these symbols of caste power and capitalism really coming together here.
225 to 350 square feet வீடுகள் எல்லாருக்கும் இல்ல கவர்மெண்ட் டிசைட் பண்றவாங்க இல்ல பேட்ச் பை பேட்ச் அப்புறம் golf grounds, hospitals, pubs, schools உங்க குழந்தைகளுக்கு free education, rich kids ke tani school, hospital unnada adula Saturday Sunday mattum ungalukku preaching idukku padana building கட்டி விட்டல என்ன சொல்றீங்க ஓசில யார் தரவே what do you think? Isn't it a silent revolution for equality? கேட்கவே மூச்சு முடுது நம்ம புது தாராக எப்படி மாறப்போகுது பார்த்தீங்களா முதல்ல நம்ம ஆர்கிடெக்ட்ஸா இருக்கோம் நம்ம பில்டர்ஸா இருக்கோம் முதல்ல ஒரு வாட்டி கையை தட்டுங்க
Dharavi will have a new name. Dharaviக்கு புது சுதந்திரம் கிடைக்க போகுது.
ஆரியா எம்ப்ளாய்ஸ் இந்த வீட்டுக்கு வருவாங்கல சூப்பர்.
ஆமா சார். கோல்ஃப் கோர்ட் நமக்கு எதுக்கு? கிரிக்கெட், ஃபுட்பால், கபடி இதெல்லாம் தான நம்ம ஆட்டம்.
ஏய் உளறாத.
அவன் சொல்றதுல என்ன தப்பு? നമുക്ക് എന്തൊക്കെ ഗോൾസ് ഗ്രൗണ്ട്
Hey, it's okay. It's okay. Ellama high class maran. Otherwise, how will your friends respect you? Huh?
ஏதாவது பர்சன்டேஜ் கொடுத்து செட்டில் பண்ணுங்க.
Stop it! Stop it, I said! எத்தனை கவர்மெண்ட்ஸ் எத்தனை பில்டர்ஸ் பட் நத்திங் ஹஸ் சேஞ்ச்ட். நான் போனப்போ எப்படி இருந்ததோ அப்படியே தான் இருக்கு. யூ ஹேவ் கன்சர்ன்ஸ், யூ ஹேவ் ப்ராப்ளம்ஸ், தென் கிவ் டு மீ இன் ரைட்டிங். கரிகாலன் கூட்டத்தை கழிச்சிட்டு பேசாம போனா என்ன அர்த்தம்?
இத பாருங்க, நான் ஸ்ட்ரைட்டா விஷயத்துக்கு வர்றேன். இது எங்க நிலம், எங்க அப்பா பாட்ட உருவாக்குன நிலம். கவர்மெண்ட் ஹெல்ப் பண்ண சொல்லுங்க. எங்க வீடு எப்படி வேணுமோ அப்படி நாங்க கட்டிக்கிறோம், சுத்தமா வச்சுக்கிறோம். அதுக்கு நான் கேரண்டி, எல்லாரும் கேரண்டி. என்னப்பா சொல்றீங்க?
எல்லாத்துக்கும் கவர்மெண்ட்னா
அப்ப எதுக்கு தான் அரசாங்கம்? அரசாங்கம் நிறைய கடன் இருக்க, பணம் இல்ல மட்டும் சொல்லாதீங்க. எல்லாத்துலயும் ஊழல் பண்ணி அதிகாரிகளும் அரசியல்வாதிகளும் சொந்தா வராங்களே, அவங்களுக்கு எங்க வந்து பணம்? இந்த இடத்த இப்போ வித்தா கூட வெறும் இடத்துக்கு 40,000 கோடி. அது சும்மா எவ்வளவுக்கோ கொடுத்துட்டு நம்ம லோகம் அலையிடுமா? ஏய் குடிச்சினாய்கா, எல்லாத்தையும் கிளப்பி வீட்டுக்கு வந்து சேரடா. கோபத்தை கிளப்புறாங்க.
All of a sudden, my presentation got so much more interesting. No, it's not going to work. That's why I do have Talia do the work for me. Okay. So there's lots of things going on in this clip that really is at the heart, right? Mumbai is undergoing rapid transformation, redevelopment. There are major social movements, right, of slum dwellers that are not going to take this lying down. And so the process of negotiation and contestation within the city has led to a whole host of policies to be able to include the poor through things that the film show, right? We're going to redevelop this land, we're going to take this land, but you're going to get status, right? So there's the politics of aspiration. You're going to be in a clean place with toilets, right? There are the toilets, having actually access to public toilets, something that most of us in the world take for granted, right? So there's a politics of aspiration in terms of improved living, a certain kind of aspiration to status, right? You'll have dignity. You'll no longer be living in muck, right? And there's a lot of kind of coded caste kind of dimensions in all of this, right? And that the builder themselves they're capitalist, but they're also upper caste, right? They come from this particular background, and the community is divided. This is really right. What's happened? Do we want to move forward with this? And who's really in charge of this? And isn't this our land? And the fact that he says this is our ancestral land, right, has a very different notion than we belong. We worked here. This is our house. There's a kind of hearkening to an identity, right, that has to do with years of oppression, right? So this kind of coming together of caste oppression and capitalist redevelopment and dispossession, but through all of these complexities, right? And I think this is kind of contextualizing. I'll contextualize a little bit how this comes into being, right? And if you see this film, it's really amazing because at the end you have this epic battle between white and black, right? Where black kind of comes to the fore, and the sort of sanitized Hindu Brahmin elite are kind of really put into question, right? Okay. So how do we get here? So the fact that you have redevelopment with resettlement is part of a long history of struggle of social movements and NGOs, right? And some of my previous work, I've looked at popular movements working alongside NGOs to really to create a sort of more collaborative projects that include the poor, right, and through resettlement. And this is one of the famous slum-based leaders that is really having this conversation with what he considers leftist movements that don't really consider the fact that people need to have clean places to live, they need toilets, that it's no human, if you're going to contest evictions and you don't have an answer for people where they're going to live, right, that's not human rights, right? There's these very colorful characters, he's a former slum dweller himself, that it's no human right to live in shit, right? So what we see happening is in the process of collaboration between NGOs, the state, and developers who are very much interested in land in the city, a market-based resettlement project comes into place. And in the entire process, women are a big part. Arjuna Bhattacharya talks about this, and in some of my work, I critique the ways in which women are essentialized as participatory and universally benefiting from all of these processes. I'll talk a little bit about how. But what we get is this kind of interesting ideal of democracy and participation and inclusivity through resettlement, right? That we're going to move towards improved living. People will no longer have to live in slums. People will get housing. They'll get toilets and water and all of the amenities that they need. They'll be able to be part of the city. And so this participatory resettlement was the model that then turned into, as I argue, a neoliberal development model. So I'm just going to show you really quickly what this looks like. Right, so this whole area right here was a massive kind of slum area. And what this particular redevelopment model entailed was that people moving out of this area would get those who were eligible. Remember in the film, not everybody is eligible. Those who are eligible who could prove residency after a certain date, many exclusions, right, to prove eligibility, would get resettlement housing, and these are the resettlement housing on site. And then, there's market rate resettlement or market rate development for builders to be able to make money off of. So this is a really lucrative deal, especially in a city like Mumbai with really high real estate market prices. People who lived in areas that couldn't be resettled on site, and this is the actual vast majority of these cases, right? So there's a promise of a home in a part of the city that will now become elite, right? If you're lucky, if you're eligible, and if not, if you're lucky, you'll get resettlement. And if it's not possible to be resettled on site, then you will get off-site resettlement. So this is one of the areas of resettlement colonies that I spend a lot of time, that activists have started to talk about as vertical slums, right? You have huge concentrations of people on the urban fringes of the city, oftentimes in incredibly polluted areas, and even still among these, there are people that are excluded. And life is pretty difficult in these vertical slums called resettlement colonies. And so one of the things that I talk about and that I've written about in the past is really thinking about this discourse of improvement of life and livelihoods, right? In these resettlement colonies, this is one of the ones that I've spent a lot of time in. It's called Logopai Compound on the eastern fringe of the city, where it's probably close to 100,000 people live. And really this kind of idea that women were going to benefit, they were going to get toilets in the home. Remember from the film, we're going to have toilets in the home. It's a big concern for women whose bodies are exposed, right? And whose need for privacy is especially great. Right? This idea that they were going to benefit the most, actually finding that a lot of women ended up losing jobs because they were living too far from their original settlements. A lot of the women working as domestic servants would go between their paid work outside of the home and their social reproductive responsibilities to their families inside of the home, finding that women actually lost a lot of jobs, decrease in income, increase in transportation costs, and a warehousing, really, right? The ghettoization of the poor. Okay. dimension of this that I think is really important, and that I've been working on with my PhD students, is really thinking about resettlement, not only in a gender and class lens, as well as, and I'll talk a little bit about how I've seen it in terms of religion, but also really paying attention to questions of caste, right? And so this is one of the resettlement colonies in this eastern part of Mumbai. The district, the ward is the M ward. It's become notorious for warehousing, basically. Warehousing resettlement colonies of the poor. It's the cheapest land that's within the city limits, right? And people who are resettled because of river cleanups, road projects, where their slums are located along the railway tracks, or where roads are planned, or this particular community was resettled, 20,000 people were settled. They were living alongside a major water pipe. And moved into this area, right, that is adjacent. This area is called Mahul. It is adjacent to some of the most toxic polluting industries, in the area. There are oil refineries, chemical plants. Nearby, there are all sorts of dumping grounds. And a study showed, actually well before this resettlement was actually took place, these people moved in about 2 years ago. And in 2013, the people who had already been living there were experiencing all manner of illnesses, respiratory illnesses, skin diseases, etc. There were studies that showed this, and still this major resettlement colony was put into this incredibly toxic, space to really die, right? To go and die. This is about resettlement, about improved housing, about improved living, and in fact, people were experiencing some of the worst kind of exposure to toxicity. And the majority of the people who live in this area, who were moved in this area, come from a Dalit background, right? The oppressed caste background, and have since been in a struggle to have alternative housing that's not next to this incredibly polluting plant, right? And the social movement that's involved in this has been talking about it it's the National Alliance of People's Movements, which is an anti-displacement movement that I've worked on, done some research with, has been talking about this as a question of, a sort of, a relegation of the poor, right, into these unlivable spaces and dispossession, but not really addressing the caste issue. And so along with my PhD student and collaborator, Pratnya Garu, we're really looking at the question of caste, right, which is on the ground. People are talking about in their places of worship. A lot of the Dalit community in Western India has converted to Buddhism because of the Hindu caste system, right? There was a big movement by B.R. Ambedkar to move into Buddhism. So in these places of worship, people are talking about this as a form of caste dispossession, right? Relegation to the outskirts, to the most polluted, right? Which is already something that Dalits have a long history of experience with. Segregation within villages, to the outskirts, segregation within cities, relegation to, the relegation of ostensibly polluted bodies to the most polluted spaces in the city. And this particular area has a long history that was actually settled. There are lots of slums in this area as well, settled traditionally by Dalits. So the history of this part of the city, it's a particular part of the M ward near Manpur, this area called Manpur near Chembur, and one part of this has really has been historically associated with the settlement of lower caste groups. And so seeing this as a form of caste oppression, right? So this kind of linking, it's not just a question of the relegation of the poor to these outskirt spaces where they're, have issues with livelihood. A lot of them are excluded, and if they are, they're exposed in this way. And there are all sorts of other problems in these resettlement colonies. sewage systems not working properly, because these are tenements that are built actually by private capital, right? There is no sort of oversight because of this win-win policy that I talked about, right? Where developers would get access to land or be able to clear an area for an infrastructure project in exchange for providing free houses to the poor, right? And so all sorts of issues of livability. And the ways in which people are experiencing this is not just that they're experiencing a kind of class-based dispossession, but really locating this in the longer history of caste-based oppression. And so this struggle continues right now to be able to find another place. The Green Tribunal, which is a court that looks at environmental issues, has actually acknowledged that this is an unlivable space and that they should be moved into a more livable space instead of this resettlement area. The state of Maharashtra is saying that actually we don't have money to be able to do this. So it's an ongoing battle. How am I doing on time? Okay. Here's another image. This is what it looks like in between some of these buildings. They're very tightly wound. There are very few services a lot of times in between these buildings. So it's like, extremely, lots of ways in which these are looted environments with few services, what people have called vertical slums. And this is kind of a gathering right here. People living in the model resettlement colony, refineries. So really kind of coming back to this idea of this definition of racism, right? Of the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability becoming really salient for understanding not only racial differentiation due to colonization and global capitalism, North-South issues, but also right within the context of the country, within the Indian context. Right, that you have differentiation among a racialized kind of differentiation, right, a naturalization of embodied inferiority among what we would consider a singular race, right? Another example of this, and I think this is very salient in relation to the Hindu nationalist populist movement, is the exclusion of a lot of Muslim minorities, which is something that ended up happening with the segregation of the city due to riots, active kind of propagation of anti-Muslim rhetoric and displacement of people. Muslims in the city have been relegated to the outskirts of the city and oftentimes evicted and considered ineligible for resettlement, right? So uncompensated eviction, the most sort of severe kind of dispossession, not even getting any kind of resettlement housing at all, and finding that they're sort of multiply experiencing multiple exclusions and dispossession based on Muslim, ethnic, or lower caste identity, right? So this relationship between identity and class is really tightly woven, and part of a kind of Hindu nationalist mission, right? Satish Deshpande talks about how this kind of the dream life of Hindu nationalism, right? This kind of way in which the nation is created as a unified, citizenry, is about creating enemies, external enemies, but also really eliding or making invisible the real hierarchies along caste that happen within so subsuming caste, right, while not actually addressing the real ongoing historical oppressions based on caste, right? And so the Shiv Sena within Mumbai has really activated this kind of discourse. So you have it at the national scale with Modi, but also these regional parties, right, that are operating in this way, that shape the landscape of slum redevelopment policies. So remember I talked about how you have the slum redevelopment policy that is neoliberal policy, market-based policy that is a win-win solution. You have developers getting the land, building tenements for slum dwellers, creating redevelopment, creating better housing, etc. But who gets that housing is severely restricted, and a lot of the discourse around who deserves housing and who doesn't really went along, religious lines. That we have to be careful that Muslims or Bangladeshis especially are invading our cities, right, and trying to get free housing, or there are people coming from North India that are invading our city. They shouldn't be rewarded, right, with free housing. So really there was a tight weaving of these discourses with actual on-the-ground practices of who is deemed worthy, right? These classic definitions of the worthy and the unworthy poor, right? We see this in American cities along racialized lines. I think this is really happening in this way in the Indian city as well. And so there's lots of pockets, right, of contestation, and what gets seen in the rubric of class struggle, right, doesn't really address the real experiences of not just class, right, but identity, caste, religious oppression, right, that really put into place these fault lines between who can really benefit from inclusive development and who can't, and how all of these politics unfold on the ground. Talked about this quote by Gilmore, and I think that this is really important right now within the Indian context and within, I think, the context all around the world, is a certain kind of dismissal of identity politics. And some of the major thinkers within India, Partha Chatterjee, talks about mobilization along caste, ethnic, other kinds of identity markers, especially around displacement, as something that is actually not very revolutionary, right? That people are negotiating along identity lines within this ethnographic state, right? And not really addressing or contesting the real drivers of capital accumulation. This is the argument. And I would say that this really misses a really important point, right? Or a really important kind of opportunity for seeing how it's not just about identity politics, right? It is about, that there are all sorts of ways in which understandings of experiences of dispossession based on one's embodied location, right, are weaved together with class and are the basis of so much struggle and so much complexity that is anti-capitalist in nature, right? And I want to kind of move beyond this, and I think that the idea of racial capitalism, right, is not something that is just about the colonial, the post-colony in Europe, or white and black, right? But that we see racialization happening, and it's deeply weaved together with processes of capitalist dispossession, and we need to have new conversations that have already started happening for decades, right? Between Ambedkar, a major anti-caste leader, and Du Bois, right? And really seeing, in the way that Cedric Robinson did, right? Seeing racial capitalism without necessarily having it be about black and white or having it be about race per se, the way that we think about it, but racialism as endemic, right? As absolutely central to the constitution of capitalism and as absolutely central to the ways in which it creates severe levels of inequality and differentiation among the working class. And these have really deep historical roots. It's not just an easy justification, right, for slavery or for, this isn't just happening right now in the moment of Trump. This has long histories, and I think that this film clip, right, Kala, really looking back at this long history, right, and the ways in which capitalism actually co-evolved with caste oppression, and that this is not just identity politics, but absolutely central to the project of dispossession and capital accumulation. I'll leave leave it at that.
Sure. Open up for questions.
Yeah, Sam.
So it's a bit Twilight Zone feeling for me to see this, because it has not just like eerie resonances, but almost literal parallels with what we've been seeing in Beijing and other cities in China. The arc of the story, the buildings even look the same at the end of the story and are located in similar places, and obviously there's a whole lot of specificity and local differences, and I've been spending most of my time, as you probably have, focusing actually on the specificity to the point where I've forgotten to compare it to ask, well, why is this the same, almost the same story, except instead of Dalits we have migrant workers, and there's all, you know, so kind of like a triangular shaped question is, what do you make of that? And then in terms of potential parallels, what besides race and caste, or in this case, or in Beijing, migrant status, is used to steal the land? Like, what else? And especially, or maybe is it just a question of race, caste, and then violence, and race and caste in terms of like who can be threatened with violence? And then the other side of that is, what besides stealing the land, like, is there also more upside for those who are perpetrating it to maintaining, to growing the inequality? Like, is there more generative work that the inequality is doing besides just using it to get a hold of the land, which is maybe valuable enough, but is there like extra stuff there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to so much think in terms of conspiracy theory. Somebody concocted these ideas to be able to legitimate. I mean, I think that there are ways in which there's opportunism, political opportunism, right? But there are really long histories here, right? In which particular groups are already kind of rendered, right? The long history of caste, right? Particular groups are already rendered, you know, inferior or disposable, or there are these ideologies that are reworked in the current moment, right? And so I think in terms of that, right? For me, there's always this. It's never just a one way, right? Insofar as there is oppression, dispossession. There's also the pushback, right? In Mumbai, I think compared to Delhi, somebody here, no, one of the previous meetings in Delhi. You know, I always think that, you know, these particular political geographies are very different. But in Mumbai, you know, there's been a long history, actually, of very vibrant slum dwellers movements, anti-caste, right, anti-caste oppression movements, so that you actually have a resettlement policy to begin with, right? And they're, you know, it's flawed in all of these different ways, but it used to be that people were either evicted and then just thrown out, you know, in the complete outskirts with nothing, or, you know, they were evicted and then they try to try to recreate. So just the very fact, right, as flawed as it is, that there is a resettlement policy and there are places, ways in which that was negotiated, right, is already something. And then now the inadequacies of that, and the hypocrisies of inclusive development coming to the fore and creating new kinds of mobilizations, right? And so I think that there's this constant process, and to me, I think it's very interesting and a very exciting time. I think whether we think of, you know, the US right now or India, the fact that there are these amazing kind of social movements, you know, we'll see how long they're, you know, it's always complicated with social movements, right, that are really making this linkage between the kinds of economic processes and the kinds of discourses of Hindu nationalism or white supremacy, right, and that these exclusions, it's not that, like we were talking about in our discussion, it's not that they're new, but actually they're coming to the surface now, and so you have much more vigorous anti-caste movements now in India. I mean, they were always there, but people are, it's unfortunately been activated in the United States as well. Black Lives Matter. And so it's a constantly evolving, right, political scenario. So we can't just sort of think of it as a one-way process. Your question was all about.
I mean, it's
A
I
little
guess
bit.
it's slightly hopeful,
Okay.
but I'm kind of asking. It feels like there's this line between like how much can they get away with, and now it's slightly less than before.
Yeah, I mean, there's constant, insofar as there's an ongoing privileging, right, of capital accumulation. There's always going to be the contradictions that are going to come to the fore, and they're going to come to the fore in ways that don't look like what classic Marxists think about, right? And I think that paying attention to that, what gets dismissed as identity politics, is really important.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that there are a lot of people who don't get approved for public council but for those who don't get approved for the resettlement, what happens to them? Where do they?
Yeah, so that first slide that I showed in the talk, there was a huge number of people that were considered ineligible for resettlement because the idea is you have to have settled in the city at this particular cutoff date. And that point, it was like January 1st, 1995. This was in 2005. And there have been successive rounds of displacement evictions, right? And the idea is, if you weren't here, that means you're a recent migrant, probably a Bangladeshi, you don't belong here, probably a Muslim, right? So many different ways in which that the idea of who are these people that don't deserve resettlement, and then also the everyday processes of getting access to the state, of having your particular area be considered eligible because of this cutoff date, right? So, and then what started to happen in Mumbai, because of these kind of Hindu nationalist, really violent social movements / political parties, right, excluding Muslims. You had riots outbreaking in the city. People started to feel very endangered. Muslims started to move into separate areas, so you see the intensification of segregation, right? And then once that happens, these particular areas are now disposable, expendable, excludable, right? And this is how a lot of folks ended up being evicted, in this particular eviction drive, up to 300,000 people evicted with no compensation because they were not deserving, they didn't belong, they were probably recent, migrants from Bangladesh. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I was just, so then the people who are resettled from those places that
Oh, what happens to them?
Yeah.
They'll either just, some of the slums were they reoccupied that land. Some of them, ended up moving to a different part of the city to, in another slum. It's just moving the slum, basically. Yeah. Doesn't solve the problem.
Great to hear you speak. Thank you. I'm here in Ohio. When we teach our students about racism, we always, and especially when I teach transnational feminist topics, we have to do a lot of work to let them know that race is not about white majority, right? And so I'm curious what you think about the ways in which kind of American anti-racist racialized formation is sort of sliding through some of these resistance movements. So, we have the racial capitalism as embedded in history of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, but the reply to that gets drawn on a global scale also has an undertone that gets carried through in terms of what racialization is. And I know there's a lot more, happening and going on, but, All Lives Matter sort of carries that racialized formation with it. I'm just curious what you think of that and how we can situate that.
Yeah, sort of, are you asking how do we get beyond the white?
Well, I'm asking that, so we have racialized and racist capitalist formations as embedded in this long history, but we also see that a reply to that process also carries imperial racialized understandings and formations through its circulation globally. So I think that then those kinds of resistances aren't just counter-racist, but they carry along with them racialization through a very European and particularly these days, I think, an American racial formation. And so I know there's tons more to the story, but I can see that in the examples that you're highlighting, and especially that maybe this is like overperformed for an American audience at a talk, right? That you pull out those kind of visualities for us. But I do see that this is happening globally, right? In Palestine and South Africa. There are all kinds of examples where American racialized formations are coming
It's just
to
like
the back
America.
door.
It's just like anti-black racism.
Yeah, so I'm
That's
just curious what you make of that and what to do with it, since the critique is about, racial capitalism, but racial resistance is also, carrying that through the back door as well.
No, definitely, and I think that it's a very, I tread in this very carefully, and I think the process of racialization is not, in this case, race, and certainly racial formation in the United States is not the same, right? And also, when we look at these concrete kinds of struggles, so for example, the Durban Conference on Anti-Racism, there was this effort to bring caste into the conversation as a form of racial violence, as a form of racism, and there's a severe pushback, right? And so there are these ways in which there's a denial and that there's an opportunity to be able to make these connections, with the important caveat of not reducing the way in which racial formation happens in India or anywhere else, or Brazil, to the American experience. I think that is a very important thing. But it's also, in terms of actual activist movements or struggles, right, there are ways in which people are trying to make this connection. And I think that in the South Asian case, right, we have a lot of, in Swati and whether you'll be able to kind of speak to this a little bit. A lot of our critical, the post-colonial scholarship, even subaltern studies, has brought in this kind of this understanding of race through the colonial encounter, but really not self-reflexive at all about caste. Within that, the kind of racial formation that happens, within India, right? And so bringing, really, this is why I think the work of Cedric Robbins is so important, that it's not about white. It's not about white versus black, that even within whiteness, and therefore even within brownness, you have racialization, and it's happening through caste hierarchy, and so much of the literature is actually dominated by, even the very critical literature is dominated by upper caste groups. And so there is something, I think within some of the anti-caste movement in India, a real kind of wanting to engage with racism without reducing it, because of the ways in which, Marxists or even post-colonial scholars in India do not actually look at their own caste location, right? And it gets reproduced in this way. So I think there's the danger of kind of reducing it to this, but there's also a real political imperative, right? And desire to be able to get beyond and to look at, okay, there's racism within India among, it's not just the white people out there, and kind of using that framework is what people have used for the
I have two separate questions, very different. One kind of goes to what you were just talking about a little bit about, sort of like how you think colonialism plays into all of this. Like if you feel like it was sort of like capitalism and then racism, and then colonialism was kind of like the result or the way that those things came together and were funneled through, or if it's sort of a third thing. And then my other very different question was about what happens with the people who get resettled but in the same place. So like they're the lucky ones who get to stay in the nicer area.
Right.
Like first of all, are those buildings actually safe? Like do they work? And then also just sort of ethnographically, like their social ties and what happens when they're in the same place and they're in like the better building, but the community has been dispersed.
Right. Yeah, so, like I said in the beginning, these areas it's not just about housing, right? There is a whole set of economic activities that are happening there. These are livelihoods. These are spaces of livelihoods that people are using that space in different ways. And so, in this high-rise redevelopment model, where everybody gets a house, that aspect of livelihood is completely, shut out. And this is why Dharavi, the actual slum that Kala the film is showing, right? This is why it hasn't been able to go through, because there are all sorts of cottage industries there and people that are like, how are we going to be able to continue in a 225 square foot apartment? Like, that doesn't make any sense, and lots of people are going to lose their jobs. And so that even in that kind of on-site resettlement case, the loss of livelihood is a really big deal. The loss of the social connections, obviously, the social networks, a lot of the informal vendors, right? In addition to the cottage industries being displaced. And then, there's the issue of, in certain cases, there's very shoddy construction, right? Sometimes there are high-rise buildings, with 7 or 10 floors, and then the elevator doesn't work. And then there's no accountability. Or there's some issue with sewage, right? The promise of having toilets in the home and all of these, improvements, and then, now you're in this building and you have a toilet that's overflowing. And so there are all sorts of issues. Sometimes I look at some of these buildings and I'm like, I don't know how long they're gonna stand, honestly, And so there are a lot of iffy dimensions to people that are the lucky ones that are resettled on site as well, and a lot of contestation as well to ensure that, since people now being resettled see the struggles that others have gone through, negotiations with the builder to ensure some kind of accountability. So that's been happening as well. And in that particular resettlement colony where I did a lot of work, you start now seeing people in these various public spaces, occupying, vendors. So there's ways in which people are attempting to create, livelihood, and also, that particular area, a lot of political mobilization to ensure better infrastructure, the power of the vote en masse, right, within the Indian neighborhoods, within the city neighborhoods, is something that, is getting some level of schools, some better roads, some attention. So there are ways in which it's a difficult situation and people are negotiating and trying the best they can to be able to get a better situation.
Thanks for a great talk. So it seems to me that arguing for racial capitalism makes a lot of sense. But when you turn to talk about Modi in particular, the RSS, I thought I heard you say that the most fundamental other things sort of Muslim power. And I don't think we want to reduce the question of Islam to race. So I wanted to ask you to clarify how you understand the relationship between anti-Islamic and racism or something like that. And then a related question, if you don't mind me bringing this back, this comes from Genuine Naivete, is that I was reading recently some very interesting reads about why the term fascism is appropriate to use with respect to RSS, particularly as being independent views among extremely right. And from the outside, I think it's inappropriate. In which case, perhaps perhaps the answer to the first question is that, like Nazism, where anti-Semitism and racism were unified in a complex of happening, there's something similar happening here today in India.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that if we're talking about Islam, there are all sorts of debates, not just within the Indian context, of the way in which the Muslim body is racialized, right? And I don't know if we need to have exceptional. I mean, any racial formation is different, and there may be something in particular to the kind of global threat of the Muslim, right? That gets tapped into, that Modi taps into, as well as the particular local history of partition and everything, right? That is specific to India. But I think that what's interesting here, and this is I'm drawing on Satish Deshpande's argument, really of how to hold this the Muslim question and the caste question together, right? And there's a way in which you have to create a nation, right? A unified nation, and you do that through not only creating an outer enemy, but also subsuming, right? I mean, Hindu nationalism is not just about anti-Muslim, but it's about caste, right? It's the Manu builders. It's or whatever other formation, right, we want to talk about. And so, Deshpande talks about how it's a subsuming, right, this promise of caste inclusion while still maintaining caste oppression, right? And you have the anti-beef lynchings that not just affect, the Muslim, but also about Dalits and all kinds of ways in which ongoing violence is there and denied within the discourse of Hindu nationalism. So I think that we have to hold those two together, the promise of inclusion, but unequal inclusion, right, that's always been there within Hinduism and within, right, the political and social and economic structure. So I don't know if that answers a little bit of that.
Yeah,
Fascism.
Yeah, yes or no? Yeah, you do.
I mean, that's what you do, Joel. I'm used to it.
No, please.
Put me on the spot.
So would you call the RSS and
Oh, is it fascist?
Is that the right term for us to use? Because no offense, but I heard you say populism, authoritarian, and neoliberal, and I didn't know.
I know, I need to get my story straight.
I don't know. Tell me.
I think we need to not be afraid of using fascism,
Okay.
personally. I think that we need to think, I think of fascism in terms of, a certain kind of rhetoric of nationalism, right? A certain way. So it's not just any kind of authoritarianism. It's not just any kind of populism. It's also a particular understanding of the nation, right? And a particular kind of control of the economy that becomes in defense of the nation. So I think all of these elements are there, and why not?
And then for the caste question, we need to go back to the Indian Constitution and the way we
Right.
I mean, that's where it is, and
Yeah.
where there's a complete line of giving the Dalits sort of political power. I mean, that has been always the problem, right? Even if all these sort of political projects we're doing, but it's, and this is all is sort of based on the foundation. And the other thing I wanted to kind of talk about is this whole question of Muslims, and especially now with the CI, this whole citizenship bill, and the National Population Registry, and the surveillance that we're seeing, specifically. And then, and also the projects that you talked about. But this question of Muslim, and it's, if you just go to, say, places like Delhi, if you go behind Jamia Millia Islamia University, where the Muslims across class is ghettoized. They choose to live there because it's the space where they feel safe. I mean, all sorts of, the way in which this sort of plays out. So the development projects, yes, but this sort of exclusionary space, absolutely. It's
segregation.
Right. I mean, it's completely segregated. All these things are very, very segregated.
And class differently, across class.
Across class, yeah.
And then how these areas get coded also, right? Especially the poorer parts of the Muslim areas as breeding grounds of terrorism, right? That segregation is not only an outgrowth of violence, right, anti-Muslim, right, but also then becomes a way in which it reinscribes these notions like, oh, this whole part, these are terrorist breeding grounds, right? That idea of these parts of the city are dangerous, right?
I mean, Gujarat, I used to live in Baroda, which used to be called mini Pakistan.
Yeah.
Like at night, auto rickshaws would refuse to take me because it's mini Pakistan.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's like these are not redevelopment areas. These are all, part of the city's planning. It's there. It's there in this planning.
Well, I was going to say one more before Madhu spoke, but so at least tell. No, you can be the one more, but I just want to offer it. Does anybody else? One question. All right, last question.
So well, I don't know how to frame this in a way that sounds like, but in general, what would you like us to do with this information?
Oh gosh!
You're a good student.
I'm not an academic, I'm just an undergrad, and I know that there's probably other people who aren't undergrads, who aren't academics either, so what do you think we should be doing just in general to help these people make a decision?
Well, many things. I think one thing is just really, really seeing, let's say, in the United States context, right? How this moment that we're in with our current president is really bifurcating, issues of the economy with issues of race, and really starting to think about how neither racial, racism nor our particular economic system, right, can continue to go on. That it is creating a mess, and that we have to understand them together, right? That it's not just you can fix the economy and then everything is fine. You have to deal with really long histories of racism, and the fact, this whole idea of the white working class, for example, and just sort of seeing the grievances happening alongside the economy, because of economic inequality, without addressing how even racism has permeated, right, across classes, right? And so really kind of working together for racial justice and economic justice, and not seeing them as separate. And so, Black Lives Matter, really looking at some of the economic, demands there, and not seeing it as, oh, this is a Black issue, or oh, this is a Muslim issue. Really seeing, really connecting the dots, right, between the different struggles and working in alliance, right? I think that's one thing that we can do in the United States. To also understand our location in the world, right? That this is not only happening in our country, but also the ways in which our corporations, right? So the Arabi in particular, this wasn't highlighted. One of the big, there were big international investment interests, right, in this, and so our multinationals here are having an effect in many other parts of the world, whether it's in Mumbai, or whether it's in the mines of Congo, or wherever, right? And so really connecting this at an international level, the kinds of consumption practices, the kinds of powers that we give our corporations have an impact on the rest of the world, right? And that we can sort of build alliances rather than with folks that are trying to address not only their own governments, but also multinational corporations that are housed in our own country, right? So I think the big lesson is connecting the dots, building alliances across movements that are normally siloed off, right? Whether it's in our own country or across. Big job, but I think that's probably where I would start.
And ready to end.
Yes.